Not this Sunday morning, because it's supposed to have been a week ago.
I thought you said something and I was just tuning into it. I was like, oh no. All right, we're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. On the agenda tonight for City Council Conference is a discussion regarding vegetative management of the rights of way. And I think starting us off is our attorney, Catherine Walker.
Thank you. So you all know we've talked about this the last couple of years or so. First, I think it was when the OG&E franchise came up and there had been some other vegetation management activities. And we're hearing about issues from council members, from residents, about making sure property owners get notice, what kind of chemicals are they using, and what can we do to protect the tree canopy. So we went through quite a bit of time, and I think CPTC, and Community Planning and Transportation Committee, going through all of the regulations, and ultimately focusing on adopting a local framework that would be consistent with both state and federal law. So we added this last February, I believe. Added Article 9 to Chapter 10 of the city's code to apply only to vegetation management activities by utilities. I'll go through this ordinance first, and then I'll talk about the other one. So that ordinance adopted the ANSI A300 standards. These are best practices created by arborists, and incorporated the pruning standards explicitly. It talks about chemical control methods, contractors, making sure the employees who are doing the work are identified as such, and cleanup. Meanwhile, the tree board was also developing a tree ordinance that would protect primarily street trees, and so this was not intended to supersede state law or utility easements, because we can't do that. But they did want to protect trees in the street right away from unnecessary removal by requiring permission from the city forester, which leads me to introduce to you Tim Vermillion, who is our new city forester. I think this might be his first council meeting.
You
so
lucky dog.
That ordinance created a process. If you wanted to alter a tree in the right-of-way, alterations include removal by definition. You get permission from the forester. The forester would grant permission if alteration is needed to eliminate damage to buildings, foundations, utilities, or pavement, or for some other good reason. And the consequence of removing a tree without that approval is an administrative fine based on the size of the tree that can be remediated by the planting of replacement trees. So with that, I want to turn it over to Tim to talk about some of the recent application of these ordinances that has led to this being on your agenda. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I'd like to welcome Don Menzie, the president of the Tree Board, and our staff foresters from the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Mark and Riley Coy. Okay, so I was approached by the Oklahoma Electrical Co-op, who's going to do some vegetation management activities along Berry Road. And per the ordinance, using the ordinance, I looked at the trees and determined that most that they were asking permission for were indeed unhealthy. Can you slide, please? Mm-hmm. I'll get into that. It just dawned on me today how several people that watched this presentation said that tree looks fine. This is a tree that has not been topped. That is a tree that has been topped. I drew a line where it was done years and years ago, and all of these are unnatural. Those are called, well, they're natural, but they're called vegetative sprouting or water sprouts. And this is a reaction to a major catastrophe, if you will, that this tree had happened to it, which was a pruning practice called topping. The reason water sprouts are so bad is they're weakly attached to the tree. I failed to include this in the presentation, but this is a cross-section of a tree where it has a branch, where the branch grew with the tree. As the branch grew in diameter, as the trunk grew in diameter, they grew together, locking that branch in. So a vegetative sprout is just attached weakly to the bark, and they fall off in ice storms, wind storms, things like that. I've spent a lot of time on Berry Road recently. Every time I go there, I see something new. Dead branches. The trees are failing, and they're going to fail. If not now, soon. And that was my justification for approving the request to remove those trees. There's a decay. Slide, please. Or you want me to do it?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So they've been topped, which is a practice that some people use. I believe it was years ago when it first happened. Topping trees is illegal in some places. It's universally known as a bad thing to do to trees. Last year was a bumper crop for sweet gums for seed production, but in particular these were, and massive seed production is often reflected or a reflection of stress that's happened in the tree. The trees tend to flower a lot more and more frequently and earlier when a tree is under stress, producing all the seed that you can see when you drive down the street.
Thank you. Councilman Bierman?
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is topping illegal in Norman?
No.
Do you think it should be?
No. It's, in my opinion, it's someone's right to do what they want with their tree. Education is foremost, to tell people that it is a bad thing. That's just my personal feelings.
What do you think about in the right of way where it's really our ability to say whether or not
I
it should
don't
happen?
think topping should be allowed, and I don't think you all top anymore. I know OG&E doesn't, I don't believe. So
So that's an
it's kind of an
abandoned practice.
antiquated practice. There's been a lot of education. Mark?
Well, if you look to the ANSI 300 standards that you're referring, that all practices should refer back to, it is not something that's recognized as an appropriate pruning practice for trees.
Yes, and that is reflected in our ordinance. It says topping is discouraged. I don't know the exact language, I just read it earlier. But so I assessed 17 trees that OEC got permission from homeowners to remove. And out of those 17, there were fines racked up on 5 trees. I measured the diameter, and the diameter's $50 per caliper inch. The fine that OEC has agreed to pay, in lieu of a fine, they're going to help me purchase trees to replant all along Berry, with my funds included, is $57.15. That's what we have so far, Clifford. Clifford is with OEC. He's the vegetation manager I've been working with on this issue. Again, a lot of people would walk down here and say, this looks fine. They're not looking up, and they're not trained to see the world through trees like I've been cursed with. But again, this is a tree that has not been topped. It's not underneath the power lines. One of the things that some of the prescriptions for trees along Berry that are right next to power poles, they need a 10-foot easement or separation from poles, because that's a ladder for children to climb up and get close to the poles. So any of the trees that are next to the poles, I categorically automatically said those are a hazard. And if he was to prune all the way up the side, there'd be nothing left for the tree. A lot of these trees, once they do this next round of vegetation management, it's going to be, I don't know, third, fourth time they've been hit like this, and the writing is on the wall for the trees. These are what the trees look like in full leaf. These are just, I did cherry pick this image because it's got, no pun intended, it's got dead sticking out of it. Several of them have that. And they also have a real chlorotic haze to them. It's kind of a lot of sweet gums have trouble in our soils, but the ones on the west side of the road are more chlorotic than the ones on the east, which tells me they're under stress. Here's another example of, these are all water sprouts. Those are not branches, well, they're branches, but they're not included in the trunk. They're just weakly attached. And that's what I'm deeming an unhealthy situation. Again, there's just another demonstration of it. Here are the water sprouts up close. You can see decay columns right here where water's going down here and rotting all this out, creating fungus. I have not seen any fungus. One of the things you can do to determine if a tree has internal rot is if there is fungus on the outside of the bark. That's the internal fungus trying to reproduce. And you'll see fruiting bodies on the outside of trees. I haven't seen any on these yet. But anyways, these are water sprouts. You can tell the difference in color, and you can see they're kind of funkily attached. I don't know the right word for that, but
Funkily.
funkily. I'm a drummer too, so I use drumming terms. Here's an internal rot. That's where the tree did not callus over properly. So that's an open conduit for water and insects. Same thing here. Here's some dead branches all around the water sprouts. Here's a broken branch. Every tree has some of that in it. Broken branch. Over here on the right, you have a widowmaker. That's what colloquially they call it. So in my opinion, the trees have had it, and that's why, again, I granted permission. So our plan is to replant all the way up and down Berry Road, everywhere we have a spot and that funding allows. And I have examples of a utility. Oh, here's an example of a good tree planting. Does anybody know where this is?
I do, Main Street.
Yeah. One of the premier horticulturists in the United States told me this is the best example of a northern red oak planting in the country. So I'll chain myself to those. But luckily there's no power lines. But see, it was planned properly. It's got room to replace the sidewalk if you need it. There's not going to be any root conflicts. It's not in a side triangle. Angelo would be proud. It's just a great example of what happens when you plant something in the right spot. Here is a row of Asian species that I planted, I think, in 2004 or 3 when I was here the first time. This is what Berry Road would look like with the right tree in the right spot underneath those power lines. And they would not have to get topped, any of these varieties. And
Those aren't Bradford pears.
no,
What are
Look like
those?
Bradford.
they do kind of. And the branching structure on this is when he first brought them over from China. These are some of the first selections, and he's selected since then for better branching. On the, it's called almost propinqua, Emerald Sunshine Elm. Guy from Clinton has championed those. But this is what I would recommend to go back with. There's parts of China and Tibet that are on the same latitude as Oklahoma. So after the Dust Bowl, the government brought a bunch of tree species from that area to Oklahoma to reforest western Oklahoma and West Texas, West Texas.
Thank you. Councilmember Patron?
Okay, so the Emerald Sunshine Elms, and that's what this is, you said?
That on the end, yeah. There's
Okay.
several varieties.
And you're suggesting that we would use an Emerald Sunshine Elm on Berry?
Several species. I've got them in a packet right here. You want me to list them all out?
Well, I'm trying to understand for a tree canopy, I mean, is that a fully grown tree?
Not quite, but it won't get much bigger than that.
Okay,
It'll spread out more. But you got to keep it low stature if it's underneath power lines. So you're stuck with using small stature trees. And one of the bad parts is you're never going to get a tunnel to drive under, which is the emotional part that's so hard about this for
and
people.
shade, yeah.
Well, I was out there the other day pruning all those. There is shade even without the leaves. You can see, and they will eventually touch. It'll take a long time, in between. But
So
I'm trying
how-
to remedy a mistake that was made years ago.
How tall do those go?
Max 20 feet, maybe. A lot of times, tree tags are written from Oregon or Washington, where conditions are perfect, and the tree can realize its genetic potential in the perfect environment. But in Oklahoma, our trees have a lot shorter stature because they're in a harsh environment. So I would say 25 tops, which is max in the best conditions. But like we learned in school, trees didn't read the book. Sometimes you have one that just does what it's not supposed to do.
So what is the height of the power line?
I don't know exactly.
16 feet.
But you have the other stuff underneath it that's at 16-ish.
Yeah, it depends on what's on the line. Sometimes you'll have a power line and a cable below or phone below. And they all have different regulations, but electric especially is heavily regulated in terms of the clearance for their electric lines. Because of course the regulations were written with their eye on reliability of electricity. And so that's really the balance here. And that's something that the Tree City and Arbor Day foundations have been pushing is right tree, right place. So larger trees, not right under the power line, appropriately sized trees under the power line to prevent this problem from reoccurring.
Any other questions?
How many years will it take for them to reach their, I mean, are we talking about getting yearling trees or like 5-year trees?
I
How
would
long is it gonna
say-
take for them to get there?
Those were 5-gallon trees when I bought them. So they were this tall, and they were about that big around. And that was in 2004, I believe, 4 or 5. So it's not a super fast process. But if we had the money, we could buy bigger trees to start with. These were just little 5 gallons. I did this all in one day, so it wasn't huge trees.
Feel like some maple varieties grow quicker and.
Oh, yeah, I have Trident maple. I have Amber maple, which it's just not my favorite. But Trident is my favorite for this project. Would you like a copy of this so you can see the species?
Sure. I am kind of a
Pass it
tree
down.
nerd.
Thank you.
Toss it across.
There's another picture from another angle. Those are Zelk over there on the end. So that is what I have. Any questions?
Who runs what utility company has the lines north of Lindsay on the east side of Barry?
I have no idea.
East side of Barry?
Yeah.
North of Lindsay on the east side of Barry.
Or west side of Barry?
North of Lindsay.
The same side, just north of Lindsay.
I don't know.
They're in the road.
Jenny, it sounds like.
Have you looked at those trees?
Yeah,
What are your
I don't remember.
conclusions?
Let's look at them again if we can on Google Earth.
Well, you'd have to look at them closer to reach the same conclusions you just reached about these trees being so diseased.
Yeah, I have not looked at them.
Well, they've been topped and managed. Look, I've lived in this neighborhood 30 years, and I think that people's expectations of a diseased dying tree is not what you're describing as a diseased dying tree. And I can, all the example, I just happened to watch your presentation driving in of, untreated trims or breaks. I can go out to my 100-year-old walnut trees in my front yard and show you all of those same features, and I don't feel like that tree's an imminent doom, public health, public safety hazard that warrants its destruction, And so you can drive all through the city. I was just coming in off I-35 down Main Street on the south side, and all of those trees, for the most part, there's a lot of cedars, and I'm not sure what the species are of the other trees, but they're big hardwood trees, and they're, trimmed in the same manner that these trees on Berry. So it just seems like, I think, to the Ward 2 residents that don't live right on Berry Road, and some that do, that the Berry Road tree canopy is getting picked on. And that was really the impetus, and that was really the motivation behind these whole tree ordinances. And so it's incredibly disappointing to hear, what'd you say, 17 trees now? You're gonna approve 12 and make them pay a fine of 5. It's just, why is this section of road being picked on? And it just seems like OEC's picking on this side of Road Cliff. I'm just telling you how I feel and how a lot of residents in our neighborhood feel. And a tree canopy is not what you're showing on Boyd, and you're destroying a canopy, a tunnel, that has a lot of emotional attachment to a lot of people in the city. And I just don't feel like this is the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. And so I guess my question to Catherine is, what recourse do we have as a city council? Is Tim's decision the ultimate decision? Is there an appeal process? Is there something that we can, and this was the problem when they started cutting those trees down before, and I wrote, and the newspaper published extensively on it, so this is not new concept. We want to talk about it. We want to have a say in what these public right-of-ways and these large, old-growth trees that take decades to produce, and produce the aesthetics and the feel and the quality of life in a neighborhood and in this city before we destroy it. And what you're talking about is not the same thing. And on another subject, before I let you answer your question, is just last week in our FEMA disaster mitigation plan, one of the proposals that this city has is to bury underground, make utility lines underground. You know, right now, 30% of the utilities in this city are underground. Every time I visit with utility companies about it, it's just a big no. But as this city grows, you know, when we're 125,000, we're going to grow to 250,000 someday, and more than half, almost all, 2/3 of the utilities, all the new utilities are going to be underground. You know, we want FEMA to give us a grant to help us, you know, put lines underground. You know, why can't we choose Berry Road as our first project? You know, I mean, this is all things for us to talk about, you know, but we've got money in the pipeline. We're waiting back from FEMA, right? Should know in a few months, maybe FEMA, you know, but do we have to make this decision today? And, you know, like I said, I don't feel like there's not a rotten tree out there where it looks like it's fixing to die and it's going to split in two any worse than any other tree. You can walk the right of way of this city and find trees that are in bad or as the same or worse shape.
Okay. So the ordinance does provide for appeals, but it's appeals for owners who've been denied permission to remove trees from their property. So it's not applicable here. I think in looking back at my notes or, you know, working through these two ordinances last fall and through the winter, maybe even before that, the goal was to balance, you know, the state and federal regulations and what we can't really regulate with what we would like to see. And one of the things that we did as a city years ago is require all new developments, as you said, to bury the lines. There's no way we can force electric companies to come in and do that later. That's, you know, doing that new development is the way we can get that done. And so you're
Well, I'm
right.
not talking about forcing anyway.
Right.
Of course, it'd be,
We
we're all
would have
working
to
on the
pay for
same
it.
team together. I don't think
Right.
anybody in this room wants a city that has a lower quality of life, you know? And I think you could go around this room and say that large mature trees add to the quality of life. I doubt anybody would argue that, you know? But what we're trying to find is some common ground that slows this process down, lets us look at some options, and maybe it's just a friendly amendment, courtesy amendment that I'd be reaching out right now to the utility company and to the city to postpone this decision for a period of time. Let us work through maybe some of our other options. There's a group of homeowners out there that have floated the idea of shared expenses between the city, the utility, and homeowners on placing more utility lines underground. There's a lot of public interest in that concept, and it just seems like Berry Road is under attack. And while we do have a group of homeowners that seem intent on removing those trees, there are a algebraic number, exponentially greater number that live around them that don't want them removed. And so could we as a city council, since there's no appeal process for those that want to save trees, produce an ordinance for the next meeting that says stop?
As it applies to this application, I don't think we can go back. We can't pass an ordinance that affects an application that's already filed.
Can we go to a judge and get some order that says don't do that?
If it's in compliance with our ordinance, I'm not sure of a reason why a judge would grant an order allowing us to stop that activity. You know,
But you
part of
could
the
ask-
issue
you could ask
here
them.
is I think it's, you know, under state and especially under federal law, the utility companies have a lot of authority to do vegetation management to protect the reliability of the grid and the service they're providing. And so we run up pretty quickly against state laws that tell us we can't do a whole lot here. And the other thing we have to consider too, because I think, you know, thinking of the opinions we've gotten from the Supreme Court, not just impacting cities, but just overall, there's a real recognition of private property owner rights. And that would be another concern I would have if the homeowner, the property owner, wants the tree removed, will a court allow a neighbor a couple streets over to come over and say you can't do that?
But we can ask them.
And that's the challenge.
I mean, you're saying you don't think they will, but you don't know they won't.
I mean, we would, to get it in front of a judge,
What would that take?
I mean,
I'd have to make a motion tonight, in 2 weeks.
no, I mean,
Because I'm not gonna roll over on this deal.
yeah.
I mean, this feels like we're just getting slapped right back in the face at the first opportunity that was the whole motivation behind this in 2017.
I mean, there'd have to be an actual controversy to get in front of a judge. And here we've got the city applying its ordinance, so if someone disagreed with it, they could sue the city. And that would be something that would go in front of a judge. I don't know how successful we would be, or how successful they would be in getting the ordinance, challenged in a way that would prevent a private property owner and an electric utility from cutting down a tree.
Might I interject? My name is
Come on up.
My name is Mark Bays. I'm a Urban Forestry Coordinator, Oklahoma Forestry Services. I have no mule in this fight. I am tree risk assessment qualified, and I don't agree with your assessment that these trees are healthy. Quite frankly, I look at these as ticking time bombs. As a surgeon, how many times do you go in and operate on an animal and leave a wound that will never close off? You don't do that. You make a very surgical cut, and you want to close that wound off to prevent any problems from moving into that animal. What's happened in this case, these wounds, you don't even have to touch these trees for the rest of their life. Those wounds are there. They will continue to decay. It's not a question of if, but when these trees fail. They will fail. My only hopes is that nobody is injured in this process, because right now what it appears is the city of Norman is preventing these people from doing their job that they are very well qualified to do. Assess risk. There is risk. There's an elevated risk. That risk will never go down. It's going to continue to increase. And look out for the litigation. If it's unfortunate that someone happens to be close by when one of these trees actually do fail.
I do know a little bit about surgery, and I do know wounds always heal. And I know I had a sweet gum
Trees
tree.
never heal.
I had a sweet gum tree in my backyard that broke a branch off this big 25 years ago. You know what? And it always had a rotten hole on it. You know what it finally did this year? It closed. So you can't, there's never always and there's never never. And all I'm saying, why is OEC, and I'm not trying to pick on OEC, I don't want to fight. You know, we've had our fights. I'm really trying to get along here, guys. But why is this stretch of road, and you can go across Lindsay Street on the same side, and those trees look rotten. I mean, it is nasty looking. I mean, these trees were worked on a couple years ago. I don't know when those trees are, but OG&E's leaving these trees alone. And it's got a tunnel canopy that's been, you know, there for, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. They were planted in the 60s. You know, they reached a canopy state, you know, in the 80s. You know, you're talking about something that is a big deal to a lot of people. And you can always make your argument, you know, but we're making this argument along one little stretch of road. We're making an argument along one stretch of road that's highly, there's a high level of affection toward for a lot of people. And I'm
Based
just
on
saying,
emotions and not the science of what's going on here. The science and the reality of what's going on is
then why
if there's other trees in other areas that are in the same condition, they should be
making the
removed.
same, proposing the same idea? Why aren't they cutting down all the rest of the trees down Berry?
That's an excellent question.
They're not under the power lines. They're
They
able to-
are under the power
On the
line.
other side of the road, they're not, sir.
No, on the north side of Lindsay, on the west side of Berry, they're under the power lines.
Well, I was saying, the other side of the road is OGD's.
I'm not talking about the other side. I'm talking about the north side of Lindsay.
Councilor Patron.
Okay, so just so I understand the facts here, are all 17 trees, he's making a mortally wounded argument, are all 17 trees that we're talking about here mortally wounded?
When we say mortally wounded, it's kind of hard to use that terminology when you're talking about trees. Those trees have been impacted. They will continue to decay inside those trees. That's just the fact of how trees respond to 30-year-old damages. That tree that you talked about that was damaged for 30 years, internal decay is going to happen.
Okay.
And the question is when will it fail? I can't predict that. You have a tree, an instance that's gone 30 years or so, but it will happen.
Okay, well, my question though, at the beginning of the presentation, we heard most of the trees, and at first was diseased, and then we went to unhealthy, no longer diseased, but to words unhealthy, and most was the original. So I'm asking, are all 17 trees in the same condition that you're describing?
I'd have to go out and look at the trees. The trees, we have walked the line, and the trees that we looked at, there was 12 of them, I think, that we looked at. And all 12 of those trees have interior decay that's happening that will continue to go on through time. Now, mortally, will that kill that tree? I don't think that's the question here. The question is when is it going to fail? Because that tree can have these sucker sprouts throughout time, but at some point, they are so weakly attached and there's so much decay going on the inside of this tree that something is going to fail. At what time that is in the future, I can't say that is. So trees have an amazing ability.
Don't all trees die at some point?
Hold on, let
Absolutely.
Councilor Patron finish her question, please.
Okay, so they haven't been like individually graded in some way to where it's like,
I think Tim
Yes,
has
I've
gone
looked at
through
every
and,
single tree that OEC has asked me to look at.
and all 17 are in the same grave state that we're,
All 17. I have never said the trees were diseased. I believe that was your wording, sir. I've just said they're unhealthy, they're in terrible condition, and they meet
Well, what's
the
the difference?
criteria of what the ordinance lays out for me to grant permission. I go by that ordinance. I don't want to go around permitting this everywhere in Norman. There'd be nothing left. But these trees met the criteria, in my opinion. They're unhealthy. Mark Bays walked it with me. Riley walked it with me. They're unhealthy. And it's
what's the
time-
deal with the 12, what's the other 5?
The 5 were borderline. They didn't get topped quite as bad, and I feel like they've got more life in them. But in all honesty, when I first looked at it, I said all of them could go if I could make that decision. I would say all of them could go.
Okay, so my next question is, he described it, you're describing topping, he's describing as like a butcher act, an open wound. Who did this?
OEC, years and years ago, before any of these people were probably working for OEC. That was their practice on those trees.
And that was a really common practice for utility companies through time, because they weren't really well versed on how trees respond to pruning. There was some work by the fellow by the name of Alex Shigo that started dissecting trees and really learning about how those trees respond to how they're pruned. More and more utility companies now are looking to make proper cuts because they realize when they make an improper cut, they are damaging that tree, creating additional risk on that trees, and they're not wanting to do that. These sweet gum that are planted underneath the power line, whoever planted them, whether it's the Rotary Club or whatever reason, they got the wrong advice. Because there's really no way to have these mature sweet gums underneath the utility line and continually come back and, cut those back and top them up, because those trees will never close over.
And they're about to get that same procedure again. OEC is going to go and they're going to do their job and prune those trees again, and they're just going to be hit harder again.
Councilmember Wilson.
So I'm calling from this a bit that there's maybe a grant out there to put some of these lines underground.
I'm doubtful, Councilor. I think you're referring to the hazard mitigation plan that we talked about last week, and we're waiting for approval of the plan. Frankly, I've been applying for grants for 30 years, and I've never gotten one. So I wouldn't
So
put a
it's
lot of emphasis
not
on
likely.
and probably not that kind of grant. We're probably going to get a grant for flooding issues or something more critical than underground power lines.
So it seems like that the sweet gum trees, which I've had two in my front yard, and they're awful trees, just FYI, in my opinion. If you have to rake up their blankety blank balls. But either who's, they're beautiful. They can be beautiful. I get that, and I love those canopies. I know everybody loves them. But I'm wondering if we can kind of get a moratorium and go to a different part of the city where it's not the core area to do the work till we could find or get an answer to a funding source of some sort to get the, I know it's very expensive because I worked in the utility industry for a while. I know it's very expensive to put that stuff. So I'm wondering what the cost is to put the lines underground. And it doesn't have to be the whole city. It can just be this kind of heritage area where we really, value the beloved canopy, and ultimately we don't want ice storms to come through and major outages, because I also lived on Berry Road when I was out of power for 9 days, so that's also a problem. So I get both sides of this, but I mean the point that you're making, do we have to do it right now? I mean, I don't know.
We can't put a moratorium on the utility company's ability to manage
Can we ask them, please?
vegetation, but we can talk to them about
Yeah.
it, certainly.
And
Maybe it's something they would agree to, but, in the meantime, we can also work on getting quotes, like some idea of what it costs to underground. I've gotten those before, but I can't recall it off the top of my head. I know I'll get it wrong if I do. So we can get that kind of information to you.
And
as
then I
well.
guess the next concern that this gentleman, and I'm sure you and everybody has, is the branches falling on a person. That widowmaker thing stands out to me. We don't want that to happen. There's a liability there for the property owners, I'm guessing, or is it the city?
I think if we've told them no,
Then it's us, right? So we want to figure out a good plan to mitigate that hazard, other than cutting the tree down. I don't know what that looks like. I'm just throwing out conciliatory suggestions.
Councilmember Wilson touched on my concern. We are now all aware that these trees are on the path to failing. There's no plausible deniability. We created an ordinance and a position to guide us on how we handle these situations. He's spoken. I totally understand Councilmember Carter's concerns that area is just getting hit harder and harder and harder. And one of the most beautiful aspects of the area is the trees. But my concern, again, legally, what have we set ourselves up for and opened the door for should something happen? Because we've sat there and put a moratorium on it, or said go pick on someone else's trees, and I understand the concerns of wanting to protect them, but they're not healthy, and we've just been told it's a matter of time. So the legal liability on that is something that stands out to me.
It's not like these trees will go to waste. One of the things that we committed to Oklahoma Forestry Services is to look for ways to utilize the wood. We've already been in contact with a couple of mill operators that are willing to come in, and some of those lower logs that may have a little bit of viable wood in them, they can mill that out and you can make products out of them. And so it's not like they're going to total waste should they come out, or when they come out, that we do have others in place. And Oklahoma Electric Co-op has agreed to partner with some of them on that. So just something, to also think about.
Councilmember Patron?
Okay, I have a couple of questions. Okay, so one of my real concerns for this area is the property values. I don't live in this area. I'm just, from my line of work, I can tell you that while you don't get that in an appraisal, like, oh, your big tree out front is worth X amount of dollars, it definitely affects the houses and the whole area's property values. And I know that it's a lot more than $5,000 for the whole neighborhood. So I'm concerned that these people are going to take a hit. And yes, I have like emotional, historic attachment to these trees, but more than that, I'm wondering what we have done to let them know that this is definitely a possibility, that their curb value it's going to be a hit. I mean, if you're talking about a whole lot of large trees in that concentrated of an area, I don't think there's really any way around it. So,
But on the flip side of that, by this house, there's a bunch of, unhealthy trees that are eventually gonna come down. Like, it's publicly discussed now, so how do we undo that now that that's out of the box?
And I guess it would be back to the question of when is that gonna happen?
Which we don't know. Councilmember Wilson, oh, go ahead.
One more follow-up on our ordinance, and I'm trying to pull it up to find out, but, I don't know if y'all have ever been to Flower Mound, Texas. They're big on property rights as well, but, they have a pretty, entailed tree ordinance, and, so I wondered if we have utilized what they've utilized with the feds, which is, protected specimen and historic tree designations.
That's in our ordinance.
Okay, so
The tree
what,
board, in writing the tree ordinance, relied heavily on ordinances from Texas. That may have been one of them, but the historic tree designation is called for in the ordinance.
okay, so how do they go about, not just these homeowners, any homeowners with these kinds of historic trees, how do they go about making sure that their tree is a historic designated tree?
Well, trees with excellent structure has to be a specimen tree. These trees would not qualify. I have it right here if you'd like to see it.
It's in
She just
section-
pulled it up.
Yeah, 10-1012.
Yeah.
The ordinance.
Okay, so ours has, so like in this particular one, that's 3 different kinds of protected trees. A specimen tree, a historic tree, and a protected tree, so by species. So I'm wondering if our historic tree is also the same thing as a specimen tree.
Specimen is a term usually meant for a tree that's by itself, isolated, and it's a perfect example. It's like best in show of a dog. It's perfect specimen. It's exactly what it's supposed to look like.
Okay, so what is that versus a historic tree?
Historic tree would be like Abner Norman's tree that had some blaze marks in it when they surveyed Norman. I went and looked for that. They thought they found it. That would be something that would be historic.
So are we down to like, there's 5 trees in Norman that qualify? I'm being,
Under the ordinance, it's gotta meet 3 characteristics that are listed out there, and so some of it's size, some of it's structure, health, high aesthetic appeal, good longevity, and historical importance, and that's the Abner Norman tree example, of course. The property owner has to nominate a tree and bring that to the forester and provide rationale for that designation. And then that can be filed as a deed restriction, but it has to be by the property owner that has the tree on their property.
so it really is that each individual tree gets qualified. Okay, it's opposite of what theirs is.
Thank you. Councilmember Wilson?
I'm wondering if we can get bigger tree replacements, rather than, there's a way to do it that way for some of them. There was more to my question, but I got lost in the.
Larger caliper trees
Larger,
to start with.
yeah.
It'd be a function of money. I just planted 10 trees at Legacy Park and it was about $4,500. And they were 3-inch caliper, about 10, 12 feet tall. That's planted in the ground with stakes.
Okay.
So
And then,
it's 10.
and I don't, maybe I'll just reserve, never mind, I'm not gonna say it's not allowed.
But perhaps that is the answer, is we know better now. They know better now. We have an opportunity to look to when we have 250,000 people and have better trees that aren't going to keep getting torn apart and falling apart. So, I mean, that's how I'm trying to look at it right now.
Can I add to that too?
Councilor Wilson?
Sorry, that, the examples, like Kate showed me on her phone, a tree that has been topped recently, and who it was by, I don't know, but can we, does our ordinance provide that if topping is a practice that happens, can we outlaw it, or make them responsible for that in a money capacity that is equal to not a sapling in the ground, but the fact that you've then kind of destroyed the integrity of our city, the way we,
Trying to find that provision in the ordinance.
that's kind of big words, destroyed the
In our
integrity
ordinances,
of our
it says
city.
topping and roundover methods are generally prohibited unless deemed appropriate for a specific tree by a certified arborist or in consultation with the property owner.
Does that have a fine attached for noncompliance?
No, this one does not.
That's the ordinance for the
This
actual
is,
utility companies.
companies.
I don't see a
Counselor-
lot of topping anymore except in the private side.
Well,
Chairman.
I drove past it all the time, and when those trees were topped, I'd say probably only a year and a half ago. I mean, it was shocking, and they were topped in the most awful-looking U pattern, where the branches are thin branches now are still extended out over the road. And thankfully, Google Earth has a very, very stark view of that, so I was able to confirm that. And that is something that I would like to see us do, is eliminate that and then put some teeth to it, because basically all we're doing is asking nicely. And I would like to go as far as we can in preventing this from happening, because for me, one of the things that I think has not been discussed here is the impact that the removal of such large trees has on our environment and our ecosystems.
And stormwater.
And stormwater. These trees serve a purpose beyond property value, beyond their nuisance capability with trees or falling limbs. I mean, when we are replacing large trees with small trees, we are destroying habitats for animals, we are reducing the amount of carbon that we are pulling out of the atmosphere, and we are doing nothing to contribute to a healthier climate in our city and a healthier ecosystem. And so I think that larger trees is the way to go, as high as we can go underneath the utility lines. And I'm even thinking that we need to go as far as a double replacement or a multiple replacement. That if you can't replace, I know you can only plant a certain size tree before it may or may not actually stay where you put it, I guess. But I think we need to talk about the replacement value of what it provides to our community as a whole and what it provides to the environment, because replacing a large carbon sucking tree with something that is 20 or 25 years smaller is not a comparable value in so many ways. And to me, that is the toughest part to swallow here. And I don't want to speak for the homeowners on Berry, but I think that if they got a multiplied replacement value as tall as you can go under, and then required the placement of some slightly larger trees, or at least larger capacity trees, that maybe can grow faster and help rebuild that canopy in a way that actually has a better and a multiplying effect on our environment and our ecosystems. I don't know if that's splitting the baby in a way that Berry Road homeowners will be okay with, but I think that that's a step in the right direction.
I say, ask me. I live
Oh,
on Berry
well.
Road,
I did not realize that anyone was here.
2602 South Berry. Mine is the
Okay,
last
if you're
house.
gonna talk, please come up
I
here
will
so we
come
can
up,
hear you.
And I apologize. My name is David Zettel, and my wife, Mary Meacham, moved into our house in 1985. The first time we saw those trees topped on the west side, I pointed that out to my council member at the time. I said, look at that. That's awful. All right. Now, in that period of time, the trees have continued to grow, and they've adapted. And I do not believe that they're going to die in the next 5 years.
Hard to say.
I do not believe they're going to die in the next 5 years. All right. Now, all trees have a lifetime. And when the woman doors north of us fell and broke her wrist, she got together with neighbors up and down, trying to convince them to get rid of the sweet gum trees because of the balls, and she fell and broke her wrist. Now, Staywicky, who was council member for a few years, put in the sidewalks. But before then, we never had people walking up and down the street. So that's another addition. That's a plus. It's my responsibility to make sure that those sidewalks are clear, basically free of sweet gum balls or other problems. I personally would take on the responsibility of having a private person come in, private company, trim those trees so that they match whatever the ordinances require for clearance. I'm willing to accept that. My wife and I love our trees. They provide shade in this morning when the sun's coming up. We certainly have sycamores in the back, and they are always shedding limbs. If you're going to complain about a few limbs falling down, go talk, look at a sycamore. Anyway, we would have been much more willing to accept what I hear people saying if we had actually seen some trees put in after the others were taken out. Very little has been done.
I've already got a plan for that. I've got stuff at
You
the
haven't
printers.
shared it with the
I've
members
shared it
of-
at the Ward 2 meeting, sir, and
Well-
I'm going to soon be going door to door, putting door hangers, offering which trees people can have. Sounds like maybe we can put
And
bigger
I don't
trees in.
even know if my house is listed as one whose trees are gonna have to be taken down.
Mr. Vermillion, would you make some time to chat with this gentleman after the meeting so we can ask any further questions we have before we wrap it up?
Okay, I'm sorry. I've
Sorry,
taken
thank
enough
you.
time.
Thank you.
Anyway, I fully support Joe Carter.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, council members?
What happens from here? I mean, is this something, I guess I'm with Joe on wondering what next steps are.
What I'm hearing is legally, there is no appeal because we followed our own ordinance that we approved, that was approved by the employee we hired. And so, and even if we did change the ordinance, this application was already on file, so it couldn't impact
OEC
these
could
trees.
withdraw their application, correct?
I assume.
So I would ask you to consider that.
And then going forward, though, we could potentially amend the ordinance to include things like no topping, add that to the list of words and concepts I've learned since being on the Norman City Council, as well as replacements, doing 2 per 1 instead of 1 per 1. So, and it seems like there's agreement to revisit this, so I'm assuming we will send it to committee and continue to look at it. But for now, I think you've touched on what the only remedy is legally right now. I really appreciate the explanation of everything. This is definitely not my area. That's why we hired you. And I appreciate OEC and OG&E being here. I think they've shown progress in how they've approached this, but we still have a long way to go. And I don't know if there's a way of going back at this point with this particular area.
We'll extend your request, Councilmember, to the utility company.
Thank you.
With that, this meeting is adjourned.